The fluorescent lights of Thompson Associates hummed their familiar tune as Mark Stevens adjusted his tie and reviewed the presentation slides one final time. At 38, he had perfected the art of Monday morning efficiency, coffee at precisely 7:15 a.m., emails sorted by priority, and project updates organized in neat folders on his mahogany desk. The construction company's Chicago office buzzed with the controlled chaos of a business, hitting its quarterly targets, and marked to quiet pride in knowing his project management skills contributed significantly to that success. Stevens, conference room and 5, called Robert Thompson from across the open office space. The company's founder and CEO carried himself with the confidence of a man who had built an empire from blueprints and determination. At 45, Robert still possessed the charisma that had convinced investors to back his vision. 15 years ago, his salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, his Italian suit impeccable, and his smile could charm contracts out of the most reluctant clients. Mark gathered his presentation materials and nodded to David Clark, the company's lead architect, who was already heading toward the conference room. David, 32 and perpetually energetic, had joined Thompson Associates straight out of graduate school. His innovative designs had earned the company several prestigious awards, and his easygoing personality made him popular among both colleagues and clients. Ready to wow them with the Riverside project? David asked, falling into step beside Mark. His enthusiasm was infectious, though Mark had always been more reserved in his optimism. The numbers speak for themselves, Mark replied, his tone measured. 60-unit luxury condominiums, projected completion in 18 months, 15% under budget. He had spent countless hours refining the timeline and cost projections, ensuring every detail was bulletproof. The conference room filled with the usual suspects, department heads, senior managers, and a few key investors who preferred to stay hands-on with major projects. Mark's presentation was methodical and thorough, each slide building upon the previous one like the foundation of the buildings he helped construct. When he finished, the room erupted in approving murmurs. Excellent work, as always, Robert said, his smile genuine. This is exactly why Thompson Associates stays ahead of the competition. Mark, I want you to take the lead on client relations for this project. David, make sure the architectural plans are bulletproof. We can't afford any delays or cost overruns. Mark felt the familiar satisfaction of recognition well earned. He had been with the company for 8 years, climbing steadily from junior project coordinator to senior manager. His methodical approach and attention to detail had made him indispensable, and Robert frequently praised his reliability in front of other staff members. As the meeting dispersed, Mark returned to his desk and checked his phone. A text message from his wife Lisa brought a smile to his face, having an amazing time in Vegas with the girls. The spa here is incredible. Miss you, honey. Love you. 2 hearts. Lisa had been planning this weekend getaway with her college friends for months. After 15 years of marriage, Mark had learned to appreciate these periodic separations. They gave him time to focus on work without guilt, and Lisa always returned refreshed and happy. Their relationship had settled into a comfortable rhythm, predictable, stable, and secure. Mark typed back, "Glad you're enjoying yourself. Don't lose too much money at the tables. See you tomorrow evening. Love you too." The afternoon passed in its usual blur of emails, phone calls, and budget reviews. Mark prided himself on leaving the office with an empty inbox and a clear plan for the following. At 6:30 p.m., he gathered his things and headed to the parking garage, where his silver BMW waited in its assigned spot. The drive to their suburban home in Oak Park took 45 minutes through Chicago's evening traffic. Mark used the time to decompress, listening to NPR's analysis of the latest economic indicators. The 2-story colonial house had been their home for 12 years, a symbol of their success and stability. Lisa had decorated it with care, blending modern functionality with classic elegance. Inside, the silence felt different than usual. Normally, Lisa's absence was temporary, a late night at her marketing agency or an evening out with friends. Knowing she was 1,500 miles away in Las Vegas created an odd emptiness that seemed to echo through the rooms. Mark heated up leftover Chinese takeout and settled in his home office to review some contracts. The familiar routine of work helped fill the quiet house. His phone buzzed occasionally with updates from various project sites, but nothing required immediate attention. At 10:47 p.m., his phone chimed with an incoming message from an unknown number with a Nevada area code. Mark's first thought was that Lisa might have lost her phone or borrowed someone else's. To contact him, he opened the message and found a video file attached. The video began innocuously enough, someone filming what appeared to be a hotel room. Mark could hear voices in the background, laughter, and the distinctive sound of clinking glasses. Then the camera focused and Mark's world tilted off its axis. There was Lisa, clearly intoxicated, sitting on the edge of a king-sized bed in what was obviously an expensive hotel suite. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smudged, and her dress was wrinkled in a way that suggested hours of activity. But it wasn't her appearance that caused Mark's blood to freeze, it was the two men sitting beside her. Robert Thompson sat to her left, his arm casually draped around Lisa's waist. His expensive shirt was unbuttoned, his tie missing entirely. To Lisa's right sat David Clark, equally disheveled, with a champagne glass in one hand and the other resting possessively on Lisa's thigh. "Are you recording?" Lisa asked, giggling as she looked directly into the camera. Her voice was slurred but unmistakable. "I want everyone to know the truth." Mark's hands began to shake as he held the phone, but he couldn't stop watching. "I'm done pretending," Lisa continued, her voice rising with drunken bravado. "I'm done being the perfect little wife to boring Mark Stevens. You know what? I'm in love with Robert Thompson." She turned to kiss Robert on the cheek, leaving a lipstick mark. "And David Clark is the most amazing lover I've ever had." David raised his champagne glass. "To new beginnings," he said, and all three clinked glasses. Lisa stood up unsteadily, swaying slightly as she faced the camera. "Mark, if you're watching this, and I hope you are, I want you to know that I'm filing for divorce when I get back. I'm going to marry Robert, and David is going to be my. She giggled. "Well, let's just say David has talents you never imagined." Robert pulled her back down onto the bed, and the three of them dissolved into laughter. The video continued for another minute, showing them passing the phone around to record messages, each more humiliating than the last. Finally, the recording ended. Mark sat in stunned silence, staring at his phone's black screen. 15 years of marriage. 15 years of building a life together, planning for the future, trusting completely. The Chinese food sat congealing on his desk, forgotten. His first emotion was disbelief. This had to be some kind of mistake, perhaps a cruel joke or a case of mistaken identity. But Lisa's face was unmistakable, as were the faces of his boss and colleague. The hotel room looked expensive, the kind of sweet high rollers received as comps in Las Vegas. Disbelief gave way to devastating hurt. The three people he trusted most in his professional and personal life had betrayed him in the most intimate way possible. They hadn't just broken his heart, they had humiliated him, recorded it, and sent it to him like a taunt. But as Mark sat in his home office, surrounded by the symbols of the life he had built so carefully, hurt began to transform into something colder and more focused. These weren't spur-of-the-moment indiscretions fueled by alcohol and bad judgment. Lisa's words suggested this had been planned. The elaborate hotel suite, the expensive champagne, the coordinated effort to record their betrayal. This was deliberate. Mark's analytical mind, the same one that had made him so successful in project management, began to work. Lisa worked in marketing and had access to client information through her agency. Robert ran the company and had insights into competitor strategies and financial data. David had access to architectural plans and building specifications. The three of them together would have unprecedented knowledge of Thompson Associates' operations. A terrible thought began to form. Mark walked to the hall closet where Lisa kept her travel bags. Her large suitcase was gone, as expected, but her smaller overnight bag remained on the top shelf. Mark pulled it down and unzipped the front pocket, where Lisa typically kept important documents during travel. The pocket was empty except for a small USB flash drive had never seen before. Mark returned to his office and inserted the drive into his computer. What he found made his blood run cold. Several records, tax documents, bank statements, all relating to Thompson Associates' business dealings. But these weren't the sanitized reports filed with the IRS. These showed the real numbers, including substantial unreported income and suspicious cash transactions. There were also emails between Robert and several clients, discussing under-the-table payments and zoning violations that had been covered up. David's name appeared frequently in documents describing substandard materials approved for use in city projects, materials that met specifications on paper but fell short in reality. Mark realized he was looking at evidence of systematic fraud, tax evasion, and building code violations. Lisa had been helping them document everything, probably as insurance against future problems. Her marketing background would have made her skilled at organizing and presenting information convincingly. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. Not only had his wife been unfaithful, but she had been actively participating in illegal activities that could destroy the company and ruin the careers of everyone involved. If this information became public, Thompson Associates would face massive lawsuits, criminal charges, and certain bankruptcy. Mark leaned back in his office chair, his mind racing through possibilities. The rational part of him knew he should confront Lisa immediately, demand explanations, perhaps even call the police. But a darker impulse was taking hold, one that whispered about justice and revenge. They had betrayed him completely, but in their arrogance, they had also given him the tools to destroy them. The USB drive contained enough evidence to bring down all three conspirators. Robert would lose his company, his reputation, and likely his freedom. David would lose his professional license and face criminal charges. Lisa would lose everything she had worked for and face prosecution as an accessory. Mark copied the contents of the USB drive to his computer's hard drive, then to a second backup drive he kept in his safe. He returned the original drive to Lisa's bag exactly as he had found it. She would return from Las Vegas tomorrow evening, probably expecting to continue their charade, while secretly planning her exit strategy. But Mark would be ready. He spent the remainder of the night researching divorce attorneys, private investigators, and the proper channels for reporting financial crimes. By dawn, he had identified the key players he would need to contact and develop a preliminary strategy for exposing the conspiracy while protecting himself. The irony wasn't lost on him. Robert and David had praised his project management skills for years, never realizing those same skills could be turned against them. Lisa had lived with him for 15 years without truly understanding the methodical patience that made him so effective in complex undertakings. They had underestimated him, treated him as a convenient fool to be discarded when no longer useful. That miscalculation would prove to be their downfall. As the sun rose over suburban Chicago, Mark Stevens began planning the most important project of his life, one that would require all of his skills in organization, timing, and execution. The goal wasn't just revenge, it was justice served with mathematical precision. The video from Las Vegas had ended one chapter of his life, but it had also provided the foundation for the next one. Mark would make sure that when this project reached completion, the only person left standing would be himself. He made coffee, showered, and prepared for another day at Thompson Associates. Today, he would begin gathering additional intelligence while maintaining the facade of loyal employee and trusting husband. Robert and David would see the same reliable Mark Stevens they had always known, never suspecting that he was now their most dangerous enemy. The project timeline was ambitious but achievable. By the time Lisa returned from her triumphant weekend in Las Vegas, Mark would have all the pieces in place for her downfall and that of her co-conspirators. In project management, success came from careful planning, precise execution, and the ability to anticipate and counter unexpected developments. Mark had never failed to deliver a project on time and within specifications. He didn't intend to start now. Tuesday morning at Thompson Associates began like any other, with Mark arriving at precisely 7:30 a.m. and a fresh cup of coffee steaming on his desk. The overnight transformation in his perspective hadn't altered his external routine. If anything, he had refined it to perfection. Every gesture, every expression, every casual interaction was now performed with the precision of a skilled actor. "Morning, Mark," Robert Thompson called from his corner office, his voice carrying the same confident tone that had once inspired loyalty. "How's the Riverside project coming along?" "Right on schedule," Mark replied, his voice betraying none of the contempt burning beneath the surface. "I've got the revised timeline ready for your review." He had spent the early morning hours not just preparing legitimate work documents, but also identifying which files would prove most valuable to Harrison Construction, Thompson Associates' primary competitor. David Clark strolled in 20 minutes later, his typical easy smile in place. "Beautiful morning, isn't it? Makes you want to take a long weekend somewhere exotic." He chuckled at his own comment, completely unaware that Mark knew exactly where he had spent his weekend and with whom. "Vegas is nice this time of year," Mark commented casually, watching David's reaction. The younger man's smile flickered for just a moment, so briefly that anyone else would have missed it. But Mark was watching with the intensity of a predator studying prey. "Yeah, I've heard the weather's great there," David replied, his tone perhaps a shade too casual. "Never been there myself." The lie rolled off his tongue so smoothly that Mark wondered how many other deceptions he had missed over the years. How long had this betrayal in building? How many conversations had contained hidden meanings and coded references to his humiliation? At 10:15 a.m., Mark excused himself for a dental appointment and drove to a small office building in downtown Chicago. Jerry Collins, private investigator, operated from a modest suite that spoke of practical efficiency rather than flashy success. Collins was a former Chicago police detective whose retirement had lasted exactly 6 months before boredom drove him back to solving problems, just with better hours and higher pay. "Mr. Stevens," Collins said, shaking hands with a grip that spoke of years handling difficult situations. "You mentioned this was a sensitive matter requiring discretion." Mark handed over a thick envelope containing copies of the financial documents from Lisa's USB drive, along with detailed notes about the 3 conspirators. "I need a complete background investigation on these individuals, financial records, travel patterns, known associates, everything you can legally obtain." Collins reviewed the materials with the methodical thoroughness of an experienced investigator. This level of fraud typically involves more than 3 people. Someone's providing inside information, someone else is facilitating the money transfers, and there's usually a lawyer or accountant helping structure the illegal transactions. "Find them all," Mark said simply. "Money is no object, but I need results within 2 weeks." "What's your end goal here?" Collins asked. "Are you planning to go to the authorities, or is this for a civil lawsuit?" Mark's smile held no warmth. "Implanting to ensure justice is served through all appropriate channels." Collins nodded slowly. In his experience, the most dangerous clients were the quiet ones who spoke about justice rather than revenge. They planned more carefully, acted more decisively, and rarely left loose ends. Mark's next stop was the law offices of Mitchell, Harrison Associates, not related to Harrison Construction, but chosen specifically for their reputation in high-stakes divorce cases. Sarah Mitchell was known for her ruthless efficiency in protecting her clients' interests, particularly when infidelity was involved. "Mr. Stevens," she said, reviewing the video evidence and financial documents Mark had brought, "this is quite comprehensive. Your wife's actions constitute not just adultery, but potentially criminal conspiracy. Are you certain you want to pursue this aggressively rather than seeking counseling or mediation?" "Completely certain," Mark replied. "I want to understand every legal option available to me, and I want to ensure my financial interests are protected regardless of what criminal charges may result from this investigation." Mitchell's smile was shark-like. "Then let's discuss how to structure this for maximum advantage. Illinois is a no-fault divorce state, But adultery can still affect property division, especially when it's connected to financial crimes that threaten marital assets. By noon, Mark had retained both Collins and Mitchell, paying substantial retainers that would ensure their immediate attention and complete discretion. His next appointment was with Michael Harrison, CEO of Harrison Construction, Thompson Associates' biggest competitor. Harrison Construction operated from a gleaming office tower that spoke of success built on legitimate business practices. Michael Harrison himself was Robert Thompson's antithesis, methodical rather than charismatic, substance over style. He had been building his company's reputation for 15 years while watching Thompson Associates win contracts through what he suspected were less than ethical means. Mr. Stevens, Harrison said, his interest clearly piqued by Mark's mysterious phone call. You mentioned you had information that might be mutually beneficial. Mark opened his briefcase and removed a folder containing copies of Thompson Associates' upcoming project bids, client contact information, and strategic planning documents. I believe Thompson Associates has been operating with unfair advantages for some time. I'd like to help level the playing field. Harrison reviewed the documents with the focused attention of a man who understood their value. This information would give us significant competitive advantages on at least 6 major fronts. What are you looking for in return? A position commensurate with my experience and skills should my current employment situation change, Mark replied. And a commitment that this information will be used ethically to compete fairly for contracts that Thompson Associates has been winning through questionable means. Done, Harrison said without hesitation. When can you start? You'll need 2 weeks to wrap up my current responsibilities professionally, Mark said, knowing that in 2 weeks, Thompson Associates would be facing investigations that would make his resignation the least of their concerns. The afternoon was spent back at Thompson Associates, where Mark played his role with Academy award-worthy performance. They attended meetings, reviewed project timelines, and made small talk with colleagues who had no idea their company was about to implode. Robert and David seemed relaxed, even jovial, clearly confident that their Vegas weekend had remained secret. At 4:30 p.m., Mark made his most important phone call of the day. The Illinois Department of Revenue's fraud hotline received thousands of tips annually, but few came with the level of documentation Mark provided. He spoke with senior investigator Patricia Wells, a 20-year veteran who specialized in complex business fraud cases. Mr. Stevens, Wells said after reviewing the preliminary information Mark had sent via secure email, these allegations are extremely serious. If substantiated, they could result in criminal charges and significant penalties. Are you prepared to testify as a witness in any resulting proceedings? Absolutely, Mark replied. I have additional evidence that I believe will be crucial to your investigation and unprepared to provide complete cooperation. Wells scheduled a formal interview for Thursday morning, giving Mark time to organize his evidence and prepare his testimony. The wheels of justice moved slowly, but they were now officially in motion. Mark arrived home that evening to find the house still empty. Lisa's flight wasn't due until 8:30 p.m., which gave him time to prepare for the performance of his life. He prepared her favorite dinner, salmon with rosemary potatoes and asparagus, and opened a bottle of the wine they had been saving for their anniversary. Every detail had to be perfect. Lisa's key turned in the lock at 9:45 p.m., and Mark heard her drop her luggage in the entryway. With the familiar thought of someone exhausted from travel, she appeared in the kitchen doorway looking genuinely surprised by the Kamala dinner waiting for her. This is so sweet, she said, her voice carrying what sounded like genuine affection. I missed you so much. She moved to embrace him, and Mark felt his stomach turn as she kissed him. This was the same mouth that had declared her intention to marry his boss and keep his colleague as a lover just days earlier. But his face showed only the warm smile of a devoted husband. Welcome home, he said softly. I thought you might be hungry after traveling. How was Vegas? Exhausting but fun, Lisa replied, settling into her chair and accepting the wine glass he offered. You know how Sarah and Jennifer are, they wanted to do everything. We barely slept. The lies came so easily, delivered with such apparent sincerity, that Mark marveled at how thoroughly he had been deceived. "Did you win anything at the casinos?" "A little bit at the slots, lost it all at blackjack," she laughed. "But the real fun was just spending time with the girls. We haven't all been together since college." Mark nodded sympathetically, playing the role of the understanding husband while mentally cataloging each deception. They ate dinner while Lisa regaled him with fictional stories about spot treatments and shopping expeditions. She mentioned meeting some interesting people but provided no details that might lead to uncomfortable questions. "I'm so glad to be home," she said as they finished the meal. "Vegas is fun for a weekend, but there's no place like home with you." The performance was flawless, and Mark realized that if he hadn't seen the video evidence, he would never have suspected anything. Lisa had always been skilled at presentation and persuasion, qualities that made her successful in marketing and, apparently, equally effective in deception. Wednesday morning brought the first signs that Mark's plan was taking effect. At 10:30 a.m., Robert received a phone call that caused his typically confident demeanor to crack visibly. Mark couldn't hear the conversation, but Robert's increasingly agitated tone and rapid pacing suggested serious trouble. "David, my office, now," Robert called across the office space, his voice tight with stress. Mark continued working on his computer while straining to catch fragments of the heated discussion taking place behind Robert's closed door. Words like investigation, audit, and immediately filtered through the walls, accompanied by David's increasingly panicked voice. 20 minutes later, both men emerged from the office looking shaken. Robert made a visible effort to compose himself before addressing the office staff. "Everyone, I need to inform you that the company will be undergoing a routine audit by the State Revenue Department," he announced, his voice steady despite the tension visible in his shoulders. "This is just standard procedure, nothing to be concerned about. Continue with your regular work and cooperate fully if any investigators need to speak with." Mark nodded along with his colleagues, maintaining an expression of mild concern rather than satisfaction. The word routine was almost certainly inaccurate. Wells had indicated that the investigation would be thorough and urgent given the evidence provided. Thursday morning, Mark called in sick and spent 3 hours with Patricia Wells at the Illinois Department of Revenue offices. The investigator was impressed by the quality and comprehensiveness of the evidence Mark presented. "Mr. Stevens, this is one of the most detailed fraud reports I've seen in 15 years, Wells said, reviewing the financial documents and cross-referencing them with Thompson Associates' official tax filings. The discrepancies are substantial and clearly intentional. We'll be issuing subpoenas for all company records by Friday afternoon." "What about the individuals involved?" Mark asked. "The audits will begin immediately for Mr. Thompson and Mr. Clark. If your wife was as involved as these documents suggest, she'll be included in the investigation. I should warn you that as her spouse, your own finances will likely be scrutinized as well." "I understand," Mark replied. "I want justice served regardless of personal cost." Wells nodded approvingly. In her experience, witnesses who were willing to accept personal consequences for the sake of justice were typically telling the truth. Friday afternoon brought chaos to Thompson Associates. Federal investigators arrived with subpoenas and began seizing computers, files, and financial records. Robert and David were escorted to separate conference rooms for questioning, while shocked employees whispered among themselves about the implications. Mark played his role perfectly, expressing the same confusion and concern as his colleagues, while secretly savoring the sight of his betrayer's world beginning to crumble. The investigation would take weeks to complete, but the public nature of the federal involvement meant that Thompson Associates' reputation was already damaged beyond repair. That evening, as Mark and Lisa sat in their living room pretending to watch television, her phone rang repeatedly with increasingly frantic calls from Robert and David. She claimed they were work-related emergencies and took the calls in private, but Mark could hear the stress in her voice as she tried to manage the crisis. Saturday morning brought the conversation Mark had been waiting for. Lisa appeared in the kitchen while he was making coffee, her face drawn with exhaustion and stress. The federal investigation had clearly rattled her more than she was willing to admit. "Mark, I need to talk to you about something," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Mark turned to face her, his expression concerned and attentive. "What's wrong? You've seemed upset since the investigation started at work." Lisa took a deep breath and Mark saw her physically steel herself for what was coming. This was the moment he had been preparing for since Tuesday evening. "I made a terrible mistake in Vegas," she began, tears starting to form in her eyes. "I was drunk and stupid and I did something I'll regret for the rest of my life." Mark moved closer, taking her hands in his with an expression of growing alarm. "What happened?" "I was unfaithful," she whispered, her voice breaking. "With Robert and David. It was just one night and it meant nothing, but I can't live with the guilt anymore." Mark's performance was flawless, shock, hurt, confusion, all playing across his features. In perfect sequence. "I don't understand. How could you, with my boss and colleague?" "I don't know," Lisa sobbed. "We were all drinking and they were being so charming and I felt appreciated in a way I haven't felt in years. But the moment it was over, I knew it was the biggest mistake of my life." Mark pulled her into his arms, feeling her tears soak through his shirt while his mind recorded every word. The digital recorder in his pocket was capturing everything: Lisa's confession, her admission of guilt, and most importantly, her acknowledgement that the affair involved both Robert and David. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked softly. "Because of the investigation," Lisa replied through her tears. "If they find out about what happened, it will look like I was involved in whatever Robert and David were doing wrong. But I swear to you, Mark, I knew nothing about any business problems. I just made one terrible personal mistake." The irony was beautiful in its perfection. Lisa was confessing to adultery while simultaneously lying about her involvement in the financial crimes, not realizing that Mark possessed evidence of both betrayals. She was trying to control the narrative, positioning herself as a remorseful wife who had made a drunken mistake rather than a co-conspirator in systematic fraud. "Do you love them?" Mark asked, his voice carefully modulated to sound like a man struggling to understand his wife's betrayal. Lisa said emphatically, "I love you. I've always loved you. This was just physical, just one stupid night. Please, Mark, can you forgive me? Can we work through this?" Mark held her for a long moment, his mind racing through the implications. Lisa was scared, not just of losing her marriage, but of being caught up in the criminal investigation. She needed Mark's forgiveness and support to maintain her cover story about being an innocent bystander to Robert and David's crimes. "I need time to think," he said finally. "This is a lot to process." "I understand," Lisa replied, relief evident in her voice. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm hoping we can find a way to rebuild what we had." As Mark comforted his sobbing wife, he reflected on the perfect symmetry of the situation. Lisa thought she was being clever by confessing to adultery while concealing her role in the financial crimes. She believed that by appearing remorseful and vulnerable, she could manipulate Mark into protecting her from the investigation. Instead, she had just provided him with the final piece of evidence needed to destroy her completely. The recording in his pocket contained her admission of guilt for adultery, evidence that would prove crucial in divorce proceedings. Her lies about the business crimes would be exposed when investigators reviewed the evidence from her USB drive. By Monday morning, Mark would have all the pieces in place for the complete destruction of everyone who would betray him. The trap was set, and his prey had walked into it voluntarily. Justice, Mark reflected, was indeed a dish best served cold. Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of autumn in Chicago, and Mark Stevens felt a sense of completion that he hadn't experienced since reviewing the final blueprints of his most successful construction projects. Every element was in place, every contingency accounted for, every timeline synchronized for maximum impact. Today, the project he had been building for 2 weeks would reach its completion. At 8 a.m. sharp, Mark walked into the offices of Mitchell, Harrison Associates, carrying A briefcase that contained the accumulated evidence of 15 years of marriage in 2 weeks. Of meticulous investigation. Sarah Mitchell waited in her conference room, surrounded by neatly organized legal documents that would reshape the lives of everyone involved. Mr. Stevens, she said, her professional smile carrying a hint of anticipation. Are you ready to proceed with filing? Completely ready, Mark replied, settling into the leather chair across from her desk. I assume you've reviewed all the evidence packages I provided? Mitchell opened a thick folder containing transcripts, financial documents, video files, and audio recordings. Her documentation is extraordinary. I've rarely seen a case where the plaintiff has such comprehensive evidence of both adultery and financial malfeasance. The recorded confession alone would be sufficient for a favorable judgment, but the business fraud evidence elevates this to an entirely different level. She handed him a document titled Petition for Dissolution of Marriage that ran to 47 pages, including detailed financial disclosures and evidence appendices. For requesting complete dissolution with extreme prejudice, citing adultery, fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. Under Illinois law, these circumstances warrant punitive measures in asset division. Mark reviewed the petition with the same attention to detail he applied to construction contracts. Every clause was precise, every claim substantiated with evidence, every financial demand justified by documented damages. What's the timeline for service of papers? Business servers will deliver documents to Mrs. Stevens at her workplace at 10:30 a.m., to Mr. Thompson at Thompson Associates at 11 a.m., and to Mr. Clark at his residence at 11:30 a.m., Mitchell replied. We're also filing criminal complaints with the Cook County District Attorney's Office, citing conspiracy to commit fraud and adultery as contributing factors to financial crimes. The simultaneous service was designed for maximum psychological impact. By the time Lisa realized she was being divorced, Robert and David would already know that their criminal conspiracy had been exposed in detail. The coordination would prevent them from developing a unified response or destroying additional evidence. At 9:45 a.m., Mark arrived at Harrison Construction's downtown offices, where Michael Harrison waited with an employment contract and a welcoming smile. The timing wasn't coincidental. Mark wanted to be safely established in his new position before Thompson Associates' final collapse. Welcome to Harrison Construction, Mark, Michael said, shaking hands with genuine warmth. I've already heard from 3 major clients who specifically requested you for their upcoming projects. Word travels fast in this industry about people who deliver results. Mark's new office overlooked the Chicago River, with a view that reminded him of the Riverside project he had developed for Thompson Associates. The irony was satisfying. He would now be competing for that same contract from a position of strength rather than working for the people who had betrayed him. At precisely 10:30 a.m., Mark's phone buzzed with a text message from Jerry Collins, package delivered to LS at marketing office. Reaction was dramatic. Video evidence if needed. Mark smiled, imagining Lisa's shock at discovering that her careful confession had been recorded and was now part of legal proceedings that would strip her of everything she had worked to achieve. The private investigator had positioned himself strategically to document her initial reaction, which would be useful if she later claimed to be surprised by the divorce filing. The second text arrived at 11 a.m., package delivered to RT Security escorted process server from building. RT made several agitated phone calls immediately. Robert Thompson's reaction was predictable. The man who had built his success on controlling information and maintaining favorable appearances would be devastated by the public nature of the legal proceedings. Thompson Associates' remaining clients would receive notification letters that afternoon, informing them of pending litigation that might affect project completion. The final text came at 11:32 a.m. Package delivered to DC subject became verbally abusive toward process server. Police called to maintain order. David Clark's response was more emotional but equally predictable. The young architect's career was built on his professional reputation and the allegations in the legal documents would destroy his standing with licensing boards and professional associations, regardless of criminal proceedings outcomes. Mark spent his first day at Harrison Construction reviewing project portfolios and meeting department heads, but his attention was divided between legitimate work and monitoring the cascading effects of his morning's legal bombardment. By 2:00 p.m., his phone was receiving a steady stream of panicked calls from all three targets, which he ignored while focusing on his new responsibilities. The first critical call came at 3:30 p.m. from Patricia Wells at the Illinois Department of Revenue. Mr. Stevens, I wanted to update you on the investigation's progress. Based on the evidence you provided and additional materials we've uncovered, we're expediting criminal referrals to federal prosecutors. The fraud appears to involve interstate commerce and tax evasion at levels that warrant federal attention. What does that mean for the timeline? Mark asked. Criminal charges will likely be filed within 30 days, Wells replied. The subject's assets are being frozen pending resolution of tax liabilities. We're also coordinating with the Securities and Exchange Commission regarding potential securities fraud related to investment representations. The federal involvement was beyond Mark's most optimistic projections. Thompson Associates wasn't just facing state tax problems, they were looking at federal charges that carried serious prison sentences. The company's assets would be frozen, making it impossible for Robert to liquidate holdings or transfer money offshore. At 5 p.m., Mark finally answered his phone when Lisa's number appeared for the 14th time since morning. Her voice was barely recognizable through her tears and panic. Mark, please, you have to talk to me, she sobbed. These lawyers are saying terrible things, claiming I was involved in business crimes. You know I would never do anything illegal. Please, can we meet somewhere private and discuss this rationally? Mark's voice remained calm and professional. Lisa, my attorney has advised me not to discuss the case directly with you. If you have questions about the legal proceedings, please contact Sarah Mitchell's office. But Mark, I love you. I confessed my mistake because I wanted to save our marriage, not destroy it. Please don't do this to us. You made your choices in Las Vegas, Mark replied evenly, in simply ensuring that those choices have appropriate consequences. Lisa's voice took on a desperate edge. What about the recording? You said you needed time to think, not that you were planning to destroy my life. That's entrapment. Mark almost smiled at her misunderstanding of legal terminology. The recording documents your voluntary confession to adultery and your acknowledgement of ongoing deception. There was no coercion or entrapment involved. You'll fight this, Lisa said, her desperation shifting toward anger. He'll prove that you manipulated me into making that confession. He'll show everyone that you're not the innocent victim you're pretending to be. You're certainly entitled to legal representation, Mark replied. I believe you'll find that the evidence speaks for itself. After ending the call, Mark drove to his house, soon to be his house exclusively, and spent the evening packing Lisa's belongings. The divorce petition specified that she had 72 hours to remove personal items before the property would be secured pending final asset division. Mark wanted everything ready for her departure. Tuesday brought news that Thompson Associates had suspended operations pending resolution of the federal investigation. Employees were given 2 weeks severance pay and assistance finding new positions, but the company's reputation was destroyed beyond repair. Robert Thompson's personal assets, including his mansion and luxury vehicles, were frozen by federal order. David Clark received notification that his architectural license was suspended pending investigation by the Illinois Board of Architecture. Without his license, he couldn't legally work on construction projects effectively, ending his career in the industry he had trained for since college. Wednesday afternoon brought an unexpected development that transformed Mark's methodical revenge into something approaching poetic justice. Jerry Collins called with urgent information about a conspiracy that was forming among Mark's former targets. Mr. Stevens, you need to know that Thompson and Clark have been meeting secretly since the legal proceedings began, Collins reported. My surveillance indicates they're planning some kind of retaliation against you. They'd been asking around about hired muscle, People who could send a message without leaving. Evidence. Mark felt a chill of genuine concern mixed with dark anticipation. What kind of message? Physical intimidation, probably not intended to be lethal but definitely meant to cause pain and fear, Collins replied. They're convinced that if they can pressure you into withdrawing the complaints, they might be able to salvage their situations. Do you have evidence of their planning? Video and audio recordings of their conversations, Collins confirmed. They're meeting in Clark's apartment, believing it's safe from surveillance. They have no idea that their desperate plotting is being documented. Mark considered the implications carefully. Robert and David's attempted retaliation would be their final mistake, one that would transform them from defendants in civil and financial crimes into perpetrators of violent felonies. Their desperation was leading them into a trap far more devastating than anything Mark had originally planned. Continue surveillance and document everything, Mark instructed. But also arrange for additional security at my residence and workplace. If they're desperate enough to consider violence, they might act impulsively. Thursday evening, as Mark was leaving Harrison Construction's offices, two men approached him in the parking garage. They were clearly not professionals. Their nervousness and clumsy approach immediately identified them as desperate amateurs hired by equally desperate employers. Mark Stevens? The larger man asked, his voice trying for intimidation but achieving only nervousness. Yes, Mark replied calmly, activating the panic button on his keychain that would alert both police and his private security team. You need to drop the legal cases against Thompson and Clark, the second man said, pulling aside his jacket to reveal a pistol tucked into his waistband. This whole situation needs to go away, and you're going to make that happen. Mark raised his hand slowly, his expression showing appropriate concern while internally noting that both men's faces were clearly visible to the security cameras he had specifically requested Harrison Construction install after learning about the threats. I understand you've been hired to deliver a message, Mark said carefully. But I think you should know that this parking garage has comprehensive surveillance and the police are already en route. The sound of sirens approaching from multiple directions caused both would-be intimidators to panic. They turned to run but found their exit blocked by Chicago Police Department vehicles that had responded to the panic alarm. Mark's security team arrived simultaneously from the opposite direction, creating a perfect containment. The arrest was swift and professional. Both men immediately began providing information about who had hired them, desperately trying to reduce their own culpability by implicating Robert and David. Within 2 hours, additional arrest warrants were issued for conspiracy to commit assault and intimidation of a witness in a federal investigation. Friday morning brought the news Mark had been anticipating since the failed intimidation attempt. Edward Thompson and David Clark were arrested at their respective residences on charges of conspiracy to commit assault, witness intimidation, and obstruction of justice. The charges were federal, carrying mandatory minimum sentences that would ensure both men faced significant prison time even if they eventually pled guilty. Mark spent Friday afternoon in his new office, reviewing project proposals that would establish Harrison Construction as the dominant force in Chicago's commercial construction market. The irony wasn't lost on him that Robert's downfall had created opportunities that would benefit Mark for years to come. Saturday morning, 6 weeks after receiving the video that had destroyed his old life, Mark signed the final divorce decree that officially ended his marriage to Lisa. The settlement was comprehensive and punitive. He received the house, both vehicles, all investment accounts, and Lisa's share of his pension fund. She retained only her personal belongings and a small savings account that had been in her name exclusively. Lisa appeared at the final hearing looking haggard and defeated. Her marketing career had ended when her involvement in the Thompson Associates scandal became public knowledge. Her association with federal criminals made her unemployable in her chosen profession, and her financial resources were exhausted by legal fees. Mr. Stevens, she said as they left the courthouse, her voice barely above a whisper. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I hope someday you can understand that I never intended for things to go this far. Mark studied her face for a moment, seeing genuine remorse mixed with desperation. Lisa, you made a series of choices that led directly to these consequences. The video from Las Vegas wasn't just about adultery, it was about your willingness to participate in fraud and your eagerness to humiliate someone who had loved you for 15 years. I was drunk and stupid, she protested weakly. No, Mark replied with finality. You were revealing who you really were when you thought there would be no consequences. The alcohol didn't create your character, it exposed it. 3 months later, Mark stood in his new corner office at Harrison Construction, reviewing architectural plans for the Riverside development project that had originally belonged to Thompson Associates. The irony was perfect, he was now managing the same project he had developed for his former employer, but with better financing, superior materials, and a construction timeline that would deliver results ahead of schedule and under budget. Robert Thompson had been sentenced to 4 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to tax evasion, fraud, and conspiracy charges. David Clark received 3 years for his role in the fraud and an additional year for the intimidation conspiracy. Both men would be released with criminal records that would make employment in their chosen professions virtually impossible. Lisa had moved back to her parents' home in Wisconsin, where she worked at a local retail store while attempting to rebuild her life. The combination of criminal association, employment termination, and social scandal had left her with limited options for starting over. On a crisp December morning, exactly 6 months after the Las Vegas video had arrived on his phone, Mark was reviewing Harrison Construction's year-end financial reports when his assistant announced that he had a visitor. Dr. Jennifer Walsh was a clinical psychologist who specialized in trauma counseling, and Mark had been seeing her monthly to process the emotional aftermath of betrayal and revenge. How are you feeling about everything now that the dust has settled? Dr. Walsh asked as they sat in the comfortable chairs of her downtown office. Mark considered the question carefully. I feel satisfied. Not happy, exactly, but satisfied that justice was served. I used my skills and resources to ensure that people who betrayed me faced appropriate consequences for their actions. Do you ever feel guilty about the extent of their punishment? No, Mark replied without hesitation. They made their choices freely, with full knowledge that their actions would hurt other people. The consequences they're facing are the direct result of their decisions, not mine. Dr. Walsh nodded. And what about moving forward? Are you ready to build new relationships based on trust? Mark smiled for the first time in months, a genuine expression of optimism rather than satisfaction with his enemy's defeat. Actually, I've been spending time with someone new. Her name is Catherine, and she's an architect who works for one of our partner firms. She's honest, intelligent, and shares my values about loyalty and integrity. That sounds promising. What have you learned about yourself through this experience? Mark thought for a moment before answering. I learned that I'm capable of more than I ever imagined, both in terms of strategic thinking and emotional resilience. I also learned that some betrayals are too fundamental to forgive, and that choosing justice over mercy isn't always the wrong decision. 6 months later, on a warm spring evening, Mark stood on the roof deck of the Riverside condominium building that had been completed ahead of schedule and celebrated as a model of innovative design and construction efficiency. The project had established Harrison Construction as Chicago's premier commercial developer and secured Mark's reputation as one of the industry's most capable managers. Catherine joined him at the deck's railing, her hand finding his as they watched the sun set over the Chicago River. She knew the full story of his divorce and his former colleague's downfall, and she had never judged him for choosing justice over forgiveness. No regrets? She asked softly, understanding the significance of this moment and this place. Mark looked out over the city where he had rebuilt his life from the ashes of betrayal, where he had proven that methodical planning and unwavering determination could overcome even the most devastating personal attacks. None whatsoever, he replied, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had faced his worst nightmare and emerged stronger than before. Sometimes the best revenge is simply ensuring that people face the natural consequences of their own choices. As they walked back toward the elevator, Mark reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The video from Las Vegas had ended one chapter of his life, but it had also provided the foundation for a better one. He had learned that betrayal, while painful, could also be liberating, freeing him from people who had never deserved his loyalty and opening doors to relationships built on genuine mutual respect. The project was complete, the results exceeded all expectations, and Mark Stevens was fine and finally ready to build something new. Thank you for taking the time to read this story. If you enjoyed it, subscribe, like and share in the comments. Remember, history is a witness to the past, a light of truth, a living memory, a teacher of life, a messenger of antiquity, and see you soon.